This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Marc Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Marc, let's talk a little bit about what the hell is going on in America.
Yeah, a lot of people are wondering what the hell is going on in America. So we are recording this today after the memorial service for Charlie Kirk in Arizona. This is like one of the most, I think this is going to be a seismic political event in our country. First of all, let's play the part where Charlie Kirk's wife forgives the man who killed him.
My husband, Charlie, he wanted to save young men, just like the one who took his life. On the cross, our Savior said, "Father, forgive them, for they not know what they do." That man, that young man, I forgive him.
That is one of the most moving things I've ever seen in my entire life, Dany. And it's in keeping with the way Charlie Kirk engaged the other side. I was aware of Charlie Kirk. I followed him, peripherally. I met him in the Fox green room, but I didn't really follow his work so much. And since he was shot, I've seen a lot of his interactions with people on college campuses. And he always engaged the other side. I didn't agree with everything he said. He's sort of Ronald Reagan, your 80% friend isn't your 20% enemy. But there were some things I disagree with him on. But he always engaged people from the other side with respect and affirmed their humanity. And when people started jeering, it's, someone would come up in some weird outfit, with purple hair and obviously, trans or something like that. And some people in the crowd would start making noises. He'd tell them to stop. He'd engage them with respect. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was killed, is because he was incredibly effective. Arthur Brooks, our former president, wrote a book called Love Your Enemies. And Charlie loved his enemies. He engaged them with love. Ironically, President Trump sort of said yesterday, one of the things Charlie and I disagreed with is I hate my enemies, but maybe Erica will convince me I'm wrong. He was firmly conservative, firm in his convictions, but engaged people on the other side with love. And that's what we need more of right now.
Yeah, look, we need more civility in our society. We have lost that. You and I have talked, over the years a number of times about a book that was written by our colleague Charles Murray called Coming Apart. And while others prefer, different books that he's authored, for me, that was a really seminal piece of work because he really explained before it happened what the phenomenon of Trumpism was. And I think that he also very neatly captured the descent of our society into opposing bubbles. Not simply bubbles where, people disagreed with each other, but where people didn't even see each other, right? Where, a person from one zip code would never meet a person from another zip code, where if you went to Harvard, you probably were going to marry somebody from Harvard. And if you worked at a gas station, you were probably going to marry somebody who worked at Costco, if you were lucky enough to get married. And that is true. Our society has become enormously stratified, not just by class, not just by race, but also by ideology. And one of the things that we see, and we saw prior to Trump's election, is that it was not simply that Republicans disagreed with Democrats, conservatives disagreed with liberals. It was that a lot of people said that they didn't have any friends and didn't know anybody who held differing views. And this really, I agree with you about Charlie Kirk, and I agree with you fully. I didn't You know, he wasn't somebody who I thought was always right. He wasn't somebody whose tone I always appreciated, but he was somebody who had the courage to listen to people who disagreed with him and to encourage them to be treated with respect. And I have a hard time thinking of a good left-wing analog to that. And now he's gone. Now he's gone. And he was a young man, 31. His wife, Erica, even younger. And she gave a very adult eulogy for her husband and preached tolerance at a time when intolerance is the coin of the realm. So I couldn't agree with you more. And my friend Elise and I, who do our, Hot Takes Happy Hour, and you and I, who don't always agree, always believe that our friendship and comedy is the most important thing, not that I'm right or you're right, or that I'm righteous or you're righteous, or that I'm moral and you're immoral. We don't see things that way. And I really wish that was what came out of Charlie Kirk's murder. I don't think it will be. I agree with you.
Well, we'll get into that. But first of all, you and I are 80% friends. We're talking about an American left. And I really don't think this is sort of a both sides situation here. I think the American left has gone so far into the fever swamps that this is really reflective of this whole situation is reflective of where the left has gone. I mean, so most of the time when a tragedy like this happens, I usually am the one to tell my kids. So, something happens in the world, Israel is attacked, the bombing of Fordo, things like that. This was a situation where my kids told me immediately before I even saw it on the news. That's the impact that he had with young people. And as I was watching it, watching the news coverage immediately after his assassination, as this was unfolding with one of my kids, he said to me, "Dad, they want us dead." That's how young people see this event. It wasn't just that they killed Charlie Kirk. The people on the left want them dead. And I don't think that he's wrong. If you look at the celebration on the left of his death, the disgusting dancing on his grave on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, on social media, it's absolutely appalling. And I think that the left has a real problem in both that it has gone so far off the course ideologically, and two, that it's embracing violence in the pursuit of its ends. There was a YouGov poll that was conducted before Kirk's killing, but they asked, do you generally consider it to be acceptable or unacceptable for a person to be happy about the death of a public figure they oppose? 91% of conservatives said it was always or usually not acceptable, as did 90% of those who were very conservative. Only 56% of those who are very liberal and 73% of liberals said celebrating the death of someone with whom they disagreed was unacceptable. And it gets worse. YouGov asked, do you think it is ever justified for citizens to resort to violence in order to achieve political aims? 83% of conservatives and 88% of those who are very conservative said violence was never justified. I wish that was higher. But on the left, 68% of liberals and 55% of those who are very liberals said political violence was never justified. 17% and 25% said it was sometimes justified. I mean, that we don't have a political violence problem on the right in the same way that they do on the left. The support for political violence or celebrating political violence in the polls, single digits. Okay, that doesn't mean that those single digits can't rear their ugly heads and do things that are disgusting. And we have our extremes in our party. But it's like I remember when after October 7th, we talked about the eruption of anti-Semitism on the left, right? And the difference between right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism is that the right-wing anti-Semitism is in the fever swamps. In the left, it's in the universities. It's on Capitol Hill in the form of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, AOC, all these celebrated champions of the left. And I think it's a similar thing with political violence, where, yeah, sure, there's a handful of people on the right who defend it, but it's kind of mainstream. In the left, it's a minority of the people on the left, obviously, in some cases just barely, but that's a serious problem on the left that so many people think. And why is that?
So I want to talk about the why is that, because I think that this is hugely important. I think we definitely have these pockets on the right, and I want us to talk about them too. But on the left, what has happened is that there is a too large segment and a too mainstream segment of the American left, not to speak of the left in Europe, which is even worse, that has persuaded themselves through rhetoric, through exaggeration, and with some credible help, that this is an existential issue, right? And so one of the things that you did was you weren't as familiar with Charlie Kirk. You went and watched some of his talks. You went and saw how he spoke on campus. You went and saw how he dealt with people. Well, I dove into the other side, right, which is the crazy town of social media on the far left. Trans people. The trans community is particularly unhinged. But, there are others as well in, white savior community, the far left of the black community. And these people genuinely believe, that there is a concerted government-backed campaign to destroy their lives. Now, obviously that's nuts. But this is where I think the nuts are aided and abetted by the non-nuts, right? So the non-nuts on the left, the people who you and I know, the think tank denizens, the columnists, the Karen Atias, your former colleague at the Washington Post, right? What is the rhetoric they like to use about the Trump administration? He's a fascist, right? He's a Nazi, okay? Our democracy is at risk. Our Constitution is being destroyed. The court has been taken over. And that is the language not of the extreme loony left. That is the argument of the left. Chuck Schumer says stuff like that, right? Okay. So
just to emphasize your point, Chuck Schumer stood on the steps of the Supreme Court and said, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you've released the whirlwind and you'll pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these decisions. A few months before, an assassin showed up at Kavanaugh's house.
Exactly. So if you think that this is the circumstance that you're in, if you believe that the second coming of Adolf Hitler is nigh, then all of a sudden, that is an excuse for violence.
Yep.
And this is the symbiosis between the far left and the mainstream left that has created the growth in this petri dish that has allowed violence to flourish. Now, as you rightly say, there are people on the right who believe that they should shoot up an abortion clinic. There are people on the right who thought that Joe Biden should be assassinated. There are people on the right who are, unacceptable exhorters to violence. But we don't have that symbiosis, right? We don't have that symbiosis between people like you and me who are on the right, conservative, but, are outraged by January 6th, right? Who are outraged by Tucker Carlson. And we don't have that symbiosis. We have not created an environment in which there is an excuse. They're not trying to kill us, right? You and I don't think they're trying to kill us. And this is this exhortation to violence that occurs on the left that creates what, I always say I hate this expression, but it creates this permission structure for violence. Because if you're trying to destroy America and everything that America stands for, everything that America has fought for 250 years, because of course the founders were fighting for the right of men to dress up as women and go into girls' locker rooms and stare at them, then all of a sudden picking up a gun is not the wrong thing to do. Celebrating the death of somebody is not the wrong thing to do. We would celebrate the death of an Adolf Hitler. We would celebrate the death of a Pol Pot, of a Mao Zedong, of a Joseph Stalin. And if your rhetoric has persuaded people that that's who is governing America, then of course it's permissible to go out and try to kill people. It's not just permissible. It's noble. And this is the challenge that we have to confront and we have to figure out how to deal with. And I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said except for they don't want to kill us. I think they do want to kill us, Dany.
Well-
And I will tell you this: my wife doesn't want me speaking on college campuses right now. And she saw the other day a story about a bomb that was placed on the bottom of a Fox News mobile van that was covering the Charlie Kirk assassination. I think it was in Utah, and it only malfunctioned. The only reason it didn't blow up. I'm in those vans all the time. Yeah, I think they're trying to kill us, Dany. There's some, not all of them, but
And
there's
do
some
you
of them.
do you think that therefore we should kill them first? Because
No,
of course
of course
right,
not.
exactly.
Of course
But
not,
that's the difference,
there's
Mark.
nobody saying that there's no credible person, there's no evidence that anyone on the right's trying to kill them. Charlie Kirk was trying to love them, and convince them and persuade them using reason. And if you want to see the difference on the right and the left, look at the reaction to Charlie Kirk's death versus the death of George Floyd. There have been no riots. There have been no looting, none of that stuff. There have been prayer vigils. There have been church services. There have been rallies. There are nuts on the right, absolutely, and we all have responsibility to police our movements. But our nuts are not in the mainstream, and our nuts are a minority. And the vast majority of conservatives are not preaching violence. They're preaching. They're doing what Erica Kirk did. They're forgiving them, the enemies, the other side, and trying to engage them. What I worry about in the wake of Charlie's death is that some people will conclude that's what you get for trying to reason with these people, right? That Charlie died because he put himself out there and tried to respectfully engage the other side, and the other side doesn't want to respectfully engage. They want us dead, and we're in their way. Because we stopped them from implementing their radical agenda. We put Donald Trump in the White House. And so we are the obstacle to their goals of dealing with all these crazy existential crises in America, like, stopping the climate change and socializing the government and all the rest of it. We're in the way, and so we're expendable. And by the way, just one more thing to underscore your point about this being mainstream rhetoric, it was Joe Biden who called Trump supporters garbage. It was Joe Biden who stood in Atlanta and gave a speech where he said that Republicans want Jim Crow 2.0, and they're the moral equivalent of Bull Connor and Jefferson Davis, right? Kamala Harris, who called Trump a fascist and said that he was going to send the military out to round up his political opponents. The fish rots at the head in the Democratic Party. And I think all those people, they won't do it, but they really need to take a deep look. And if you did it, I haven't done the numbers, but I guarantee you, if you look at the number of references to calling conservatives fascists in the week before and the week after Charlie Kirk's death, they doubled down on it in the week after his death. There have been more public references to fascism in the news since Charlie Kirk's death than I was even seeing beforehand. So, they're doubling down on hate and fascism and dehumanizing rhetoric, and it is a danger to our republic. That's the existential danger to our country.
I want to not skip talking about the right-wing cancel culture question, but I want to know what you think. How do we help? Right? Because, of course, you and I sit around and, observe and blame and call for accountability. But how do we help? How do we
help what?
How do we help back from the brink?
Well, first of all, I think this whole left-wing tilt toward defending free speech since Charlie Kirk's death is a load of crap. I mean, I am sorry. You look at this idiot, Jimmy Kimmel, who is apparently coming back on the air after a brief hiatus, and how outrageous it is that he's being censored for speaking. That Jimmy Kimmel was the one who was congratulating ABC News for firing Roseanne Barr a few years ago. You can go to any one of these people who is complaining about that and find how they celebrated canceling people for views they disagreed with. So I just think there's the hypocrisy. Second of all, cancel culture was if you said that there are two genders, male and female, and that you can't change from one to the other, you could get canceled. If you were saying things that are biological fact, and we're not running around saying, "Oh, the emperor has a beautiful set of clothes on" when he's standing there naked, and you were not lying about the biological reality, you could get canceled for that. That is a far different thing from saying that somebody who chants "from the river to the sea" and globalize the Intifada and tears down hostage posters in New York should not be fired for doing that. You know, if I stood after the George Floyd massacre and said, "From sea to shining sea, America will be free of all black people. Send them back to Africa," how long do you think I'd be employed at AEI or the Washington Post for saying that, right? Because it would be outrageous. You know, if you are a virulent anti-Semite who is preaching genocide against the Jews, yeah, I think you should lose your job. And if you are celebrating the political assassination of Charlie Kirk, yeah, I think you should lose your job. And by the way, that's not cancel culture. That's consequences. The First Amendment gives you the right to say what you want to say without being arrested for it. It doesn't give you the right to not have the consequences of your speech. It's one thing to cancel somebody for mainstream political viewpoints, and it's another thing to say, does institution X really want to be employing a doctor or a nurse or the head of a school system or a teacher who celebrates the murder of a young man who is simply going on college campuses to engage the other side, or celebrates the massacre of 1,700 Jews on October 7th. I think those are very, very different things.
I agree with you, but you didn't answer my question. And I want to talk more about Jimmy Kimmel, but first I want to press you. And I'm pressing you a little bit unfairly because
Okay.
because
That's okay.
because
Never fair me, Dany.
yeah, right. You're a victim. You're being canceled as we speak.
Exactly. Canceled by Dany.
But what do we do? So I agree, and I have a lot I want to say about the cancel culture questions. But how do we advance this idea? So one of the things that I'm very proud of, that I always insisted on at AEI, was that we didn't have events where we were only sharing one perspective, unless it was a speech, in which case it was obvious it was only one perspective, but that we actually tried to make the case, for the risks of bombing Iran as opposed to the rewards of bombing Iran and things like that. Obviously we're both foreign policy people, although you have a much heavier foot in the domestic policy camp than I do, just by virtue of having been a speechwriter and a columnist and a TV commentator. But what do we do? How do we advance the idea that the right way to move forward and disagree is, as our late boss used to say, agree to disagree agreeably? How do we do that?
Two steps.
Yeah.
One, I think we should be unrelenting in trying to crush the voices of hate on the other side. So that's the first step, right? Yeah. All the anti-Semites, fire them. All the anti-Semites on college campuses, deport them. All the people celebrating Charlie Kirk's murder, cancel them, 100%. And then two, elevate the reasonable people on the other side and engage with them, right? The polls that I shared at the start of this were shocking, but the majority of people on the left don't feel this way, right? On the far left, it's pretty high. But there are lots of reasonable people on the other side. And so I guess the answer to your question is be more like Charlie Kirk. So there's two ways to respond to Charlie's death. There is, we can match the hate of the people who celebrated his death, or we can match the love with which he engaged the other side. What I think we should do is double down on free speech and conservative speech. There should be more conservative speakers on college campuses than there in the wake of Charlie's death than there were before. By the way, every college president should be scheduling a Charlie Kirk lecture on their college campus this fall and inviting a prominent conservative to come speak and insisting that their campus engage them civilly. And we should be seeking out reasonable voices on the other side and giving them, to the extent that we have platforms, sharing our platforms with them to that, because honestly, we can't solve the problem of violence on the other side. Everybody has to police their own movements. And we need to elevate and strengthen and engage the people who do want to do that and give them a chance to express the fact that they disagree with this and engage those people. So it's a combination of crushing the bad people and elevating the good people.
Okay, so I like this a lot. I thought you were giving me sort of a snarky, clever answer by saying crush those other people as your first step. But actually, you are advocating what I have always advocated, for example, among the Palestinians, right? Why should we be stuck with Hamas and Fatah? What we should be doing is finding the people who we want to work with and putting our good housekeeping imprimatur on them and creating a competition. And I think that that's exactly right. I think that rewarding people who condemn this, rewarding people who want to debate, rewarding people who understand that just because we disagree doesn't mean that the other side is immoral, irretrievable, irremediable, evil, which is of course the word we hear too often. I think that what did our former colleague David Gerson always say? You can't beat something with nothing. And that is exactly right. Yes, they should police their own side, but yes, we should absolutely be reaching out to people, as I think AEI has so often done, and find people to talk to who don't think that shooting someone is the answer.
But one more thing, though. But
yeah.
the ways we can do that, this is both, and the two fronts on which I think we need to shun. We need to be doing some shunning are people who celebrate political assassination and people who celebrate the death of Jews and who attack Israel. So, for example, last year I was invited to speak at the Royal College of Defence Studies in the UK, and I went and spoke to their school of all the officers from all over the world, which included people from the Middle East, included Israeli officers, included all sorts of people from all different forms of country. And I was invited again to speak this year. And I just sent them a note saying, you just banned Israel from participating in the Royal War College. I find that appalling. And as long as that ban is in place, I will never speak at your institution again. We shouldn't be engaging the Royal War College. In any level, they should be shunned, right?
Totally.
So if you are a otherwise mainstream, credible institution that gives into this left-wing hate, then we shun you. If you are a liberal institution or mainstream institution that takes a courageous stand on it and is willing to engage, then we embrace you. But we have to have standards on this kind of stuff. So that's an example of where I think we need to hold the mainstream people, because you started out with a really, really good point, which is that it's not just the fever swamps on the left. It's mainstream people who are tolerating this stuff. And the people who tolerate it need to pay a price for that.
Yeah, look, I agree with that. I totally agree with that, and I bring that attitude towards everything. You know, I won't buy anything from Valentino because it's owned by the Qataris. I won't go on Al Jazeera because it's owned by the Qataris. I won't speak at colleges where they celebrate Hamas, etc. So I agree with that entirely. So I want to tell you what I think about Jimmy Kimmel. Elise and I talked about this last week on our little TV show, our little Substack TV show. I was delighted when he got taken off the air because I can't stand him. He's an asshole. He really is. And you know what? Worse yet, he's not funny, right?
Yes.
You know, he's funny at the expense of the right, 1% of the time. He's almost never funny at the expense
His biggest
of the
crime
left.
is, and with Colbert, is they've ruined late night comedy.
Okay, but and I also was completely comfortable with the idea that Nexstar and Sinclair Broadcasting, two major private companies that carry ABC, decided not to put him back on the air. I was fine with that. What I wasn't fine with was the FCC.
I agree.
You agree. I'm glad to hear that. So
100%.
This is one of those things where Donald Trump takes a good thing, right? And actually takes a very valid point. I thought he made a very valid point about 60 Minutes editing Kamala Harris to make her look better. I thought that was a blatantly political act on their part and the kind of thing that the FCC should get involved with because it was fraudulent, right? But the idea that the FCC should be in the business of policing First Amendment statements on TV is insane to me. Let the market speak, right? Colbert was taken off the air at the end of the day because the majority of people who watched him didn't think he was funny. So he couldn't get the advertising dollars. So it wasn't worth carrying him anymore because he was just a load. And that will become true of Jimmy Kimmel just as it has with others. But we shouldn't have an FCC. We shouldn't have an organization dedicated to policing what is said on TV. This is, as you described, this is the left using government to enforce their norms. And we can bet that having gotten involved in this, which I thought was stupid, the next time we're going to have a Democrat in the White House, their FCC is going to get involved when someone says something bad about trans people, when someone says something unacceptable about a black woman, when someone says it'll never be our norms. It'll be the norms of the far left. And that's why Congress ought to get rid of the FCC. The National
There
Review
you go. I agree with that 100%. And I think this problem, first of all, I agree with you that the FCC shouldn't have gotten involved, and the market was handling it just fine. And if anything, the fact that the FCC got involved got all the lefties up in arms, and like now probably even though Kimmel's ratings are worse than Colbert's, he'll probably survive longer because of it, because of the peer pressure in Hollywood not to give in to cancellation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we should just, first of all, there's an argument to be made, which I don't agree with, but there's an argument to be made that the FCC regulates the public airwaves, which is different than cable, which is different than other forms of communication, and so therefore they have a role in policing decency and other things like that on the air. I would wonder, I don't know the numbers, but I would be shocked if 90% of people didn't get ABC through like streaming versus the airwaves. I don't know. I think the airwaves are disappearing as a form of television communication anyway. I don't know. Does any of our listeners still have rabbit ears? We're all getting it through the streaming apps and through cable and all the rest of it. So I think this is a problem that's going away, and I think the FCC should go away as well. But it's funny how the left's reaction is to this. They rally around Jimmy Kimmel. The reality is that what Kimmel and Colbert and all these guys, late night comedy used to be the place where we would all go after a long day at work. You would come home, you'd cook dinner, you'd watch the evening news with Walter Cronkite or whoever it was at the time.
Peter Jones.
You'd have your dinner with your family, then you'd go to bed and you'd sit and read and maybe put on Johnny Carson for some lighthearted entertainment and comedy before you fell asleep. And instead, they've turned it into a nightly political, anti-conservative, anti-Trump, anti-Republican political rally. And it's just their greatest crime is that they're boring.
And they're not funny.
And they've taken that away from half the country. They don't want half the country's. Michael Jordan famously said, "Republicans buy shoes too." Republicans like comedy too. And it's fun to make fun of Trump as long as you make fun of the other side too. Saturday Night Live used to do both sides, right? And now the
Saturday Night Live has actually gotten better about doing both sides again, although they had a long period of being the house comedians of the Democratic Party. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the Jew-hating stuff here, because actually I was really surprised. I know that's obviously marks me as a freaking lunatic, because I should have realized that the likes of Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens would suggest that there was a Jewish conspiracy to kill Charlie Kirk. But I've got to say, speaking of throwing around the word Nazi loosely, I have not heard statements so reminiscent of Nazi Germany in modern America from people who have very, very strong followings. What Tucker Carlson said and his effort to tie Kirk's death to the Jewish murder of Jesus. What Candace Owens has said, which is that the Israeli government had him killed. What a lot of lunatics on social media are saying is just freaking unbelievable. How do we purge these people?
Well, Fox News did it by firing Tucker. Remember when Trump was getting ready to bomb Iran? And Tucker was complaining about it and publicly criticizing for it. And he said, maybe Tucker ought to get a show on a network, right? you know, to express his views. So, you know, I think, quite frankly, Fox's decision to fire Tucker Carlson is probably the greatest public service that's been done to policing the right since Bill Buckley purged the Birchers from the pages of National Review. The problem is when Buckley purged the Birchers from the pages of National Review,
They didn't have Substack to go to.
Exactly. All they had was their mimeograph machines and their mailing lists, right? If you weren't writing for National Review or some of the few other, you know, mainstream conservative publications, you weren't getting your views out. You were a crank. And today you've got Twitter and you've got Substack and you've got all these different platforms that are the modern version of the mimeograph machine, but just much more prolific. I'd love to see what Tucker's real ratings for his programs are, because, you know, when you and I both know, we both had the experience of putting a post up on X and it gets 1 million impressions, 2 million impressions, 3 million impressions. Oh my God, we've really had an impact. And then you realize the impression doesn't mean that they watched the whole thing, right? So Tucker puts up an hour-long show. How many people actually watch the whole hour-long show or even a significant segment versus liking a clip on X? So, you know, I think that he is a waning force. But again, my view of all this, I always say the same thing. Everybody, we have a responsibility to police our own movement. I think we've done a better job than the left of doing that, but there's still people who we need to make sure are shunned in our movement, and Tucker is number one on my list.
Tucker and Candace. Although Candace is so insane that
I mean, he's pretty insane too.
Yeah, no,
I mean, read if you want to understand the psychosis of Tucker Carlson, just read the huge Wall Street Journal weekend profile of him during the campaign, where he talked about how he was visited by a CIA official who told him that the CIA was assassinating people inside the United States. I mean, you know, just read that well-reported. They interviewed him. It was like that, and he just I read that and I thought, man, now I understand why he went off the deep end. You know, that's where he is.
Yeah, well, I wish the president would do more of this, because I think he really is the person who has the most credibility to be able to shut them up. I wish that Elon Musk and X was a little bit more aggressive in denying them airtime for exhortations to violence against Jews. At the end of the day, I mean, they are self-foiling in certain ways, but I mean, we've seen Jews murdered, right? We saw Josh Shapiro's house attacked. We saw two Israelis attacked by pro-Palestine lunatic in Washington, D.C.
Murdered.
We've seen synagogue murdered. Right, yeah, a young couple. And of course, this is less bad than what we see in Europe, where people have really gone batshit insane. I wish we could do better at crushing this. I really do, because you're right. I mean, we need to police our own side, and I would love to see us succeed.
Yep, I agree with you. So before we wrap up, can I raise another issue that I think is really important? Let's talk a little bit about the impact Charlie Kirk's killing has had on this generation of young Americans. There was an interesting poll right after the election that showed that there was, and we've talked about this on the pod, that there's a split within Gen Z. That the Gen Z, if you break them by age, the 23 to 29-year-old Gen Z voted +6 Democrat, but the 18 to 22-year-olds voted +12 Republican. And that's a big difference. And I started to think about why is that? And you think about what these people have experienced in their lives. Their formative experience with government was the COVID lockdowns. Right. Government took away their school and forced them into online school when there was absolutely no reason for them not to be able to do that. Government forced them to wear masks. In case of Amherst College, double masking outside at one point, right? Government took away their sports, took away their clubs, took away their activities, and unleashed a mental health crisis in their generation, right? And then the lockdowns lifted, they got to college, and what did they experience? They were assaulted by the pronoun police. They were assaulted by the cancel culture, which if you look at we've had Greg Lukianoff from Fire on our podcast, where the vast majority of students, particularly those on the right, are afraid to say what they think in class, right? And then October 7th happened, and they were assaulted by the pro-Hamas protesters on their campuses and all these lunatics. And now the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who was the guy coming to their campuses to engage the other side respectfully. I think this generation is going to be profoundly affected by this confluence of events. And, the whole idea of Gen Z, Gen Alpha, these are all sort of arbitrary designations of time. I think the end of Gen Z and the beginning of Gen Alpha are going to be profoundly more conservative as a result of this, in reaction to this assault of the far left on their childhood, this assault of the far left on their college years. And they look at Charlie Kirk's murder and say, they want me dead, these other people on the other side. And I think that's going to profoundly change our politics going forward. And just look at the turnout for the first Turning Point event after Charlie's death the other day. There were people filled in a hall in a university, and I'm sure there are going to be Turning Point events on every campus, and it'll be literally full to the brim. I think that's a great thing for America. I love the frat boys in at USC who saved the American flag. I think that's the future of our country. I think the left has reaped something from its assault on young Americans that's going to sow huge political change. I don't know. What do you think, Dany?
Look, yes, up to a point. I agree with the environment that you described, and I think we have not yet seen the full fruit of the disastrous COVID reaction, the disgraceful COVID reaction. When people see someone like RFK, who is, to my mind, as insane as pretty much anybody we've discussed today, talking about, vaccines, et cetera. This is what you get, right? When you politicize science, you open the door to politicizing science. And that's what COVID did. And when you take people away from a workplace and mentors and structure and school and education and relationships, you reap a generation of loners. And we haven't seen the full fruits of that yet either. But I also think that there's an analog on the left, which is that there are a lot of young people who are frankly unhinged, who believe that their parents are committing thought crimes by saying, oh, is your friend a man or a woman? That believe that Israel is committing genocide, that believe things that are so far from reality and so far from just. We always thought that Greta Thunberg was a joke because she's so obviously mentally unwell. But actually,
a lot of people mentally unwell.
There's a lot of Greta Thunbergs out there. And that, unfortunately, is going to be one of the prices that we pay, is that just as you see the Charlie Kirks, just as you see those poll numbers, you also see this insane and unhinged reaction on the other side. Neo-Stalinists, neo-Marxists, the overreach that we have sometimes seen on the right, we are also seeing very much on the left. And I really hope that fades out. I think there's a broad recognition in certain circles of the Democratic Party that overreach has really hurt them politically. But I think there are other circles inside the Democratic Party. When AOC believes that she has a shot at running for president of the United States.
I don't think she doesn't.
Right. Then that tells you something, that something's wrong. Something's wrong. What did they say on Seinfeld? Something's missing. Something's missing, all right. And this is something we're going to have to contend with and talk about a lot more.
So I agree with you 100%. And I think two things are happening on the left. One, the left, as opposed to the right, is inherently authoritarian because their ideology is that, Bill Buckley famously said that I'd rather be governed by the first 5,000 names in the Boston Telephone Directory than the faculty of Harvard, right? The left wants to be governed by the faculty of Harvard. The left, their basic ideology is that a small group of well-educated, thoughtful people know better how to run the country and how to run your life than you do. And ours is the opposite. we believe that individuals can make better decisions about their own lives than the government or than an educated cabal of elites. And so you have a fundamental problem intrinsically within the two ideologies, which is one is maximizing freedom. Don Rumsfeld, I know you love all my Rumsfeldisms, said free people are free to be stupid, right? You know, we believe that free people are free to be stupid, and if you want to have a stupid opinion, you're perfectly willing to have it. They don't think free people. They don't think we should be free to be stupid in their view. That we can't be. Our ideas have to be stopped and crushed, and they have to implement them. So that's one. And then second of all, COVID brought out the inner authoritarian in everyone on the left. They got to tell you, put on your mask. They got to tell you, no, you can't go into school. You can't come into this building. You can't have your sports club. You can't have your activities. And then all that power was taken away when the COVID restrictions were lifted. And I think some people miss it.
Oh, yeah.
I think they miss being able to tell us how to live our lives.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like, you know, and so I think there's that frustration as well. And so there's this reflexive, no, we're going to tell you how to live your life because we know better than you how to live your life. And that fundamental clash, it has been intensified in the post-COVID environment, and I don't think it's going away.
Yeah, look, I agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And, you know, I'm not much of a resistance type, but yeah, we need to resist that with all the power of our being because God help us. That brought out my inner freedom fighter, you know, and you know me. I'm very sciencey.
Do not comply. That's the new.
I'm a fake doctor, and wow, was that?
So were a few
really,
of the people who were telling us to stay out of our schools.
Yeah. I mean, geez Louise. Anyway, long story short, yes, there's a lot to be wary of, and there's a lot to educate ourselves about, and there's a lot of kindness and decency that we can bring to the conversation, and I hope that we will be able to do that because it's one of the things that I appreciate most about my colleagues at AEI and about my friends, in this case, you are both, is that you know, we model decent behavior. Not always, we're not perfect, but keeping an open mind, understanding that people who disagree with us are not evil or immoral, at least not always, is an important thing. And I hope I was
you ignorant slut.
Exactly. Exactly. What you said. Anyway, folks, thanks for listening, and we'll see you back next week.
Take care.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Marc Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.